Well, the Iowa offense will face a depleted Tennessee secondary on New Year's Day. After that, the Hawkeyes will look ahead to hiring a new offensive coordinator. Joining us now on Eye on the Hawks, friend of the program, David Eickholt. We're looking like the Manning cast here with the quarter zips on this show. David, few have insider access quite like yourself. What is the latest on Iowa's OC search? Who are some names that you're hearing in the lead up to the Citrus Bowl now?
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting process. I don't anticipate Iowa actually making the hire until the second week of January. But right now, if I had to put a betting odds favorite or put my crystal ball on someone, it's going to be former Wisconsin head coach Paul Chryst. I think this makes a lot of sense because if you talk about what Kirk Ferentz has tried to, become throughout the course of his career, he's tried to be what Wisconsin was under Paul Chryst, an efficient running game, good play action, and at least reliable enough quarterback play while still having an elite defense and a good enough special team. So Paul Chryst, I think, is my favorite right now. Another name I'd still keep in mind is Joe Philbin. I know that name circulated a couple of weeks ago, and he did previously work under Kirk Ferentz back from 1999 to 2002, worked with the offensive line. Now, the one big red flag, I think, with Joe Philbin is he's not an experienced play caller. And what people might not know about Paul Chryst is Paul Chryst actually was Wisconsin's play caller until 2020. Then obviously we saw what happened when he was let go from the University of Wisconsin. But Paul Chryst and Kirk Ferentz have a great relationship. They have a lot of respect for one another. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And quite frankly, Owen, I think it's a home run hire if Iowa gets Paul Chryst because Kirk Ferentz is not going to change his style of play. Maybe add some new wrinkles, but not change the complete style of play. There have also been a couple of other names between NFL analysts and some guys that, Kirk might want to bring down from those ranks. But those are more speculative right now and through secondhand sources. So I don't want to give any direct names, but there have been more talks outside of guys like Joe Philbin and Paul Chryst. But I do think Paul Chryst is probably the leading candidate right now.
Yeah, it sounds like those two are the names that we've heard the most. Let's go into Paul Chryst specifically. What is it that you think about him that makes him the perfect hire for Iowa?
I mean, I think you look at Iowa's best teams, they have a great running attack. And what's, Paul Chryst offense been known for? Dynamic running backs and great offensive linemen. And that's exactly what Kirk Ferentz wants to see his offense do. And I think you look at that running back room right now and you get really excited. I mean, I reported a couple of weeks ago that it is expected that Iowa is going to be able to hold on to Caleb Johnson, LaShawn Williams, and Jazian Patterson, kind of that three-headed monster, and guys that bring a little bit of different elements and complement one another's game. So I think you do that. You return a lot of the offensive line from this past season, install maybe some more gap running schemes instead of some zone running schemes. I think it makes a lot of sense from that standpoint. And on top of that, I think Paul Chryst, just from an experienced play caller standpoint, he doesn't overcomplicate things. He balances being aggressive, taking smart shots, but understanding the foundation of who they are and maximizing that potential. Now, I do think it's going to be a little bit difficult to flip it in 1 year, but when you're talking about the offense that ranked dead last in total yardage, if he can get Iowa up to a top 90 offense, top 85 offense next year, Owen, I think you're potentially looking at another double-digit win Iowa team if they can hold on to some other guys. As we heard, Jay Higgins is returning. We'll see what happens with guys like Jamari Harris and some of the defensive linemen. Maybe Sebastian Castro ends up running it back. Maybe they get Luke Lachey back. But there are some foundational pieces that I think should excite Iowa fans going into next season. But again, I think Paul Chryst just makes a lot of sense for what Kirk Ferentz has always wanted to do. And on top of that, Paul Chryst has just run a more efficient version of what Kirk Ferentz has run. And I think when you're Iowa, you know your identity. You don't want to go too far outside your comfort zone. I think it's a really, really good fit for the two guys.
Well, whether it's Paul Chryst or Joe Philbin or somebody else, will Brian's successor be the quarterback's coach again, or do you think those duties will be given to somebody else?
I think it depends on who the hire is. I mean, I think, it'll be interesting to see if there's any more coaches shuffling, because as we kind of heard Kirk talk throughout the last couple of months, he doesn't like making coaching changes until he can take a step back and really fully evaluate the season. That's part of the reason why he was very upset that Brian was publicly let go, even though Brian finished the season. It was an unnecessary distraction to him. But I think if you get Paul Chryst, I think you do let him become the quarterback's coach. Again, he has experience doing that. The statistics when he was at Wisconsin, I think, speak for itself. I think they'd be a good fit. But let's say Joe Philbin gets there. I don't think you really want Joe Philbin running that quarterback room. But I'd also say, okay, what if you get an offensive coordinator / passing game coordinator? What if you get a wide receivers coach / offensive coordinator? So I'm not saying anybody's going to get fired, but I'm also saying Kirk will take a step back at the end of the season. And could there be potential for more shakeup? I don't think that's out of the question. Am I going to bet on that? No, but I do think if it's Paul Chryst, I think it makes a lot of sense to keep him as the quarterback's coach and the offensive coordinator. And I think when you look around the trend of college football, we're seeing more and more of that, whether it be passing game coordinator / offensive coordinator, whether it be quarterback coach, offensive coordinator. I mean, even if you flip over to the Iowa defense, right? You have Phil Parker coaching the secondary and being the defensive coordinator. So I think it would make a lot of sense from that standpoint, but I do think it is solely going to depend on who Iowa hires.
Now, there was some discussion about whether Brian Ferentz would even coach in the Citrus Bowl. Why do you think that he decided to join the Hawkeyes for this final game of the season?
Look, I said earlier a few weeks ago, I don't think it made a lot of sense for Brian to coach the bowl game. I think it made sense for him to kind of take a step back. They aren't playing for a championship anymore. But, Owen, you've gotten to know Brian as well as I have over the past couple of years. This is just not in his DNA. Unless he got another job with an NFL team that started next week, Brian was going to finish out this season. I think it's important for him to be with this group. And, despite the public opinion of Brian Ferentz, despite all the, rightful or wrong criticism, however you want to see fit, Brian has the loyalty and the love from his guys. Like, Brian's guys are Brian's guys. And I think there's a lot of love that they have for him and, him willing to finish this season for Iowa. And I think Brian too, his dad's the head coach. I think just having one more final game together makes a lot of sense. Go out on top. But I do think, again, that Brian is going to be hired by somebody. I think it's more likely the NFL ranks than the college ranks. I think it makes a lot of sense from that standpoint. But let's say Brian had gotten a job and the contract and the ink dried last week. Brian would not be coaching in this bowl game. But at this point, it's just sort of you embrace it. They have one final game together. Iowa fans have one more game with this group, and then we're going to see what happens. And I think a very storyline riddled offseason for the squad.
Yeah, win or lose, you have to imagine there's going to be an emotional sideline between him and his dad on Monday, on New Year's Day. Well, have you heard anything about his potential job prospects, where Brian Ferentz might land after this season is finally over?
Yeah, I still think you need to see what happens in the NFL. I mean, there's still a couple of weeks remaining. All my Packers are going to obviously disappoint me sometime in the next 2 weeks. But look, Brian is just a guy. He's an offensive line guru, and he knows how to coach tight ends. And if you have a Bill Belichick endorsement and Rob Gronkowski endorsement saying, Brian's a big reason he learned how to block so well, Brian's going to get hired. Now, I think the most likely situation is I want to see what happens with Bill Belichick after this season. There's been a lot of talk that he is not going to return as the New England Patriots head coach. And what if he makes a run with the Chargers? The Chargers are looking for a head coach. I think that can make a lot of sense for Belichick to kind of get Justin Herbert, kind of rebrand himself. Might need a tight end coach. Might need an offensive line coach. They have a long-standing history with one another. So I think if Bill Belichick does not return to New England and he wants to continue coaching the NFL, I'm keeping a very, very close eye on what Bill Belichick does with some of his staff wherever he takes over.
You touched on it a little bit previously, but do you think there are some more coaches that we see leave the program after this season, whether they're released, whether they leave on their own? Do you think that there's a few more staff members that are not going to be with the Hawkeyes next season?
I think it's certainly in the cards. I don't think anything is a done deal by any means, but I also think it makes a lot of sense for a couple of coaches to potentially move on. I think there's been a lot of heat around this group. And I think you look at, Liddell Betts has been great for the running back room. Abdul Hodge has crushed the tight end room. I think he's going to continue to do a great job, especially with some of the recruits that they have in there. But there's a couple other guys, I think, on Iowa staff where you look at the offense has been near the bottom for the past 3 years. Like, at some point, something has to give. Now, will Kirk let them go? Kirk's not been a guy that traditionally lets go position coaches. He's loyal, sometimes to a fault, according to who you ask. But I do think it's in the cards. I don't think anything's a done deal, but I am going to be paying attention, I think, for the first 3 or 4 weeks of January, just to see kind of how the cards end up unfolding, because I do think it would make a lot of sense for some potential movement. But as we've kind of seen with Iowa is how Iowa is. And for better or for worse, they know who they are and they're going to stick to it.
David, we very much appreciate all of your help on the show this year. Give the folks at home one last plug for the holidays right now.
Just stay locked into HawkeyeInsider.com, 24/7 sports, and at David Eickholt on X. And as always, Owen, I appreciate the opportunity. And I'll see you soon.
The man with the knowledge, David Eickholt. Thanks for joining us, man.